Good afternoon, everyone. And to those of you just tuning in now, welcome to Politico's Sustainable Future Week. My name is Marianne Gros. I'm a sustainability reporter for Politico. I'm delighted to be here today to moderate this discussion on Europe's progress in slashing packaging waste. As some of you may know, the EU recently adopted its new packaging regulation, which will come into force at the beginning of 2025, after what can only be described as a very intense period of negotiations and lobbying. Our discussion is all the more relevant given that the final round of international talks on the Global Plastic Treaty ended in Busan last Sunday without a deal, as delegations failed to agree on setting binding targets for the reduction of plastic production. We're also seeing the impact of this evolving global context on economic actors, with some brands already starting to recalibrate their sustainability objectives, most recently with Coca-Cola choosing to drop a voluntary reusable packaging target. I am joined on stage today by Alejandro Dorado Najera, the Commissioner for Circular Economy at the Ministry for Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge in Spain, Joanne Marek-Simon, who is the founder of Zero Waste Europe, and Francesca Stevens, the Secretary General of the European Association for Packaging and the Environment. Now, the new regulation, in short, will require EU countries to reduce packaging waste by 15% by 2040. It also says that all packaging placed on the EU market must be recyclable by 2030, and that this packaging must be recycled at scale by 2035, among a handful of other binding targets. Alejandro, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. Are you satisfied with the final regulation, and what is Spain already doing to prepare for its implementation?
Well, we are quite satisfied by the regulation. It's true that we could have maybe more ambition in some terms, for example, in prevention, more focus on prevention. But it's true that it's a satisfying agreement. That's why we pushed for it in the Council. And it's true that different countries, different member states, depart from different points. It's true that we still have to reach the targets of previous regulations, and we are trying hard to do that. And we are, for example, pushing for national legislation that I know that has to comply and to be harmonized with this regulation. And we are trying to put together these two different ways of approaching the problem of waste generation in terms of packaging and packaging waste with our own legislation, the Spanish packaging and packaging waste regulation, trying to screen and to see where we can go ahead or where we have been short in terms of taking measures. And well, we are waiting for the final publication of the regulation, and we are trying to put forward new measures in order to reach the targets that are set by the PPWR.
Joanne, what about you? Are you satisfied with the regulation and how it looks now?
I have to say that, well, first of all, on the process, I want to say that it's, as you have mentioned, it's been quite a typical decision-making process in a sense that there was a lot of pressure. So, like, first off, I think that there's some lessons learned there, because, like, I don't know, we've seen like some lobbies really breaking the lobbying rules in Brussels, like the way the studies have been promoted, and actually some actions. And the sad thing with that is that actually that has paid off. We have seen how, like, the regulation, for example, gives quite a free pass to the paper packaging. And I think for me, one of the important things that the PPWR had to do is actually create a level playing field, so actually that is material agnostic, and I don't think that has been achieved. On the content, you have said it, the purpose of the revision of this packaging regulation, of the packaging directive, was to stop the increase in the packaging waste generation that had increased around 20% in the last 15 years. Has increased more than 50% in the last 40 years, but we don't talk about that. So what the goal was, well, let's put a 15% reduction by 2040, which basically would send us back 15 years back. But for me, like, one, is that sufficient? We know that in order to comply with the Paris Agreement target, we will need to reduce by 70, 80%. So we are not in line with our own climate agenda. But let's assume that the 15% is the right target. I don't think that the regulation has the measures in it to actually allow us to do that. Yes, there's a bit on reuse, there's a bit on restrictions. At the same time, the member states cannot impose new bans because that would go against the internal market. So actually, I don't know how the countries are going to deliver on the target of 15% reduction because the measures are not there. So, I mean, that's for me an open question. How do we move ahead from here?
Mm-hmm. We're going to get the chance to come back on that point about measures. But before we do, Francesca, Europen represents businesses from lots of different industries and sectors that are going to be affected by these rules. And as mentioned, some of these industries were told off for their overzealous lobbying during the negotiations. So I wonder, do your members think, do they consider this file a win? Did they get what they wanted with this regulation?
There are lots of different questions in there, and certainly lots of things I'd like to comment on for sure. So first of all, Europe represents all of the materials and the entire value chain, so the full vertical integrated value chain. So we go from the raw material manufacturers for all the different materials, all the way down to the users of packaging. So must certainly push strongly back on the allegations that some materials had a free pass with a regulation that's completely wrong and not accurate at all. Of course, if you want a totally material neutral legislation, additional things should have been taken into account, like emissions and carbon intensity, something that, of course, the PPWR does not consider. Having said that, I think the biggest problem with current European legislation is this witch hunt against material, depending which one on the day. So one day we have plastic, one day we have paper. Let's see what's coming next. In the past has been metal as well. So I think that's the total wrong approach to address circular economy and sustainability. Perhaps let me also reflect on the lobbyist infringement of rules allegations. We were personally not affected by that. I know there has been a couple of investigations open. Europe was not confronted with that. At the same time, I'm also not aware of any continuation of those investigations. So actually, I have no information about any lobbying rules not being abided for, in spite of allegation being made. But it would be interesting to see actually what's the outcome of those investigations.
So not a win then?
No. So in terms of the regulation, we've been extremely supportive from the start. So the regulation is very important because it contains very important targets in order to further drive the circularity of packaging, the sustainability of packaging. I like to say that our members are not just affected by the regulation, they're driving this change because innovation comes from industry and many of the companies are already ahead of the curve, not just European members, of course, but the broader value chain. There are lots of weak spots, however. One is lack of harmonization, and I hope we can talk a little bit more in detail about that. And very, very weak also rules when it comes to waste management. So at the moment, we have a very imbalanced piece of legislation with a very important and strong target on industry, and hardly any target or very weak provision when it comes to how this beautiful, recyclable, and reusable packaging is actually going to come back into the system and be reused, because they're very precious resources that we need to put back into the system. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, is the weakest spot of the packaging regulation, and unfortunately of the upcoming Waste Framework Directive. Let's see if we're more lucky with the Circular Economy Act.
Can you be a little bit more precise in terms of concrete examples of operational challenges industries are facing with this new regulation?
Sure. Well, you mentioned it's more than an operational challenge. So you mentioned recyclability scale. So as European, and I believe the broader industry as well, but certainly European has been extremely supportive of the 2030 recyclability targets. So our responsibility will be to design packaging so that by 2030, all packaging put on the market will have to be fully recyclable. Else, there will be no market access. We have also been equally strongly supportive of the Commission proposal to make sure that by 2035, all packaging will have to be recycled in practice and at scale. Now, looking at the fact that there are 18 potential member states out of 27 not even meeting the 2025 recycling targets. They all received a letter last year from the European Commission because they are very far off in meeting recycling targets. Our question now is, if we don't address what clearly we should have addressed, but we haven't addressed, waste management and harmonization of waste management rules, collection, number one. How are we going to achieve recyclability scale? So we're going to pour in money into new packaging solution and design. We're going to work on the design for recycling guidelines. We're going to have all this beautiful recyclable packaging, and ultimately will not be recycled because member states are not bothered to do the collection. I'm oversimplifying, but that's a big problem with waste management, huge resistance to do anything more than business as usual. The comment Alejandro made earlier, I am a little bit tired of hearing the member states have different starting point. The waste management is a national issue. We're talking about doing something drastic and revolutionary when we talk about circular economy. So industry has been asked to change completely shape, size, color, and packaging, and we can't, for example, harmonize even the color of the bins. You know, I've been part of this discussion, and when I suggested that, I was the only person in the room in favor, certainly, waste management organization, and also from the NGOs community, we haven't got much support. There is a huge amount of resistance, huge amount at national level, at local level, to actually discuss how we're going to create a single market for secondary raw material. Mm-hmm. How we're going to get this packaging back into the system. And we keep on actually being confronted with divergent national rules.
Alejandro, perhaps you'd like to comment on this. How is Spain doing with regards to collection and recycling?
It's true that's an issue. It's true that we lack capacity, and we have to invest in the creation of new capacity in terms of treatment, in terms of collection of waste in general, of packaging waste. But it's true that we have to also invest in the private sector, in the industry, in the recycling industry, in the reusability, all the logistics that we are going to need in order to put forward these measures of this regulation or others. And we are, in the case of Spain, we are trying to go hand by hand with the private sectors, and we are trying to invest in public-private partnerships. We have a scheme that we call PERTE, which is a plan for the recovery and transformation of the economy that comes from the Next Generation funds. It's up to 500 million euros that go to public sectors, to projects that try to create these capacities in terms of recycling. Also for the public sector, we have like a line of financing, because we are, as you know, a decentralized country, and the responsibilities of the collection and the treatment of the waste are in the local governments. So it's quite complex to coordinate all the actors in this chain. And also we are trying to put forward public awareness, because I think that in some other aspects of environmental issues, we have been quite I don't know, we have succeeded in letting people know how important it is to change some habits, or letting people know why we are taking some measures or approving some norms or regulations in terms, for example, of decarbonization, or in order to mitigate or to fight climate change. But we haven't had the same succeed in terms of letting people know how a problem is waste management, waste generation, and we have to focus. And I think that that's something that is missing from the regulation on prevention. It's true that we can recycle, we can reuse, but we are always forgetting like the higher stages of the waste hierarchy, which is prevention. And it's true that there are goals on targets on prevention in the regulation, but those are quite weak. And it's a general target, not a target by sector or by material or waste flow. And I think that is something to be improved, maybe in the Circular Act regulation. It's true that we are probably, with all the regulation that was approved during the last years in the European Union or in some countries as Spain, we are focusing on waste treatment. We are sometimes, and it's good, focusing on producers with the eco-design for sustainable products regulation, for example. But we are missing the part of the the fostering of this secondary raw material market. And we need European secondary raw material market is one of the things, one of the advices of LETA report, and Draghi report also highlights the lack of investment in circular economy in those terms. And I think that we have to try to invest to create the capacities we are missing, also in terms of research and development, and also in terms of training in order to have professionals for this new dimension of development, which is circular economy.
Now, in terms of what member states are doing and how far they're able to implement EU regulation on the waste management sector, Spain is one of the countries with the highest numbers of infringement cases against it, according to European Commission data from 2023. So maybe it's gone better in the last year. But what makes implementation of EU waste management law at the national level so difficult? And is the PPWR compatible with any of Spain's existing legislation on for the sector?
It is compatible, and I think that one of the reasons that I already mentioned, one of the reasons why it's difficult to implement the legislation in Spain is, first of all, because we don't have this public awareness, or even the private awareness in terms of businesses, but also the responsibility of waste treatment is in local governments, but the penalties are paid by the state. I mean, when we have an infringement, it is to the state. To the state, I mean, to the national government. Not, it doesn't go. There's no way to link this infringement with the administration, the authorities that are responsible, the final responsible of this lack of treatment in terms of waste. So I think that we have to do an effort in terms of letting people know that if they recycle, if the waste treatment is more efficient, they are gonna pay less, for example, in terms of the waste tax on waste that they pay to the local authorities. It's true that the legislation that I mentioned before, one previous legislation, the Spanish law on waste and contaminated soils for a circular economy, is trying to advance in this awareness of the local authorities. Now, for example, local authorities must put forward a tax that completes the total amount of the payment that they have to put in order to do this waste treatment. Before they could hide this tax in other taxes or in other aspects of their normal functioning of the local authority, and now they have to show to the citizens how much they have to pay. We have put forward some measures in terms of taxation. For example, a tax on virgin plastic. You don't have to pay this tax if you're using recycled plastic or if you're using reusable packaging, for example. But if not, you have to pay a tax for virgin plastic. And it's true that coming from this law as well, because the extending producer responsibility schemes fail to achieve a target that we set as the collection of 70% of plastic beverage bottles under 3 liters in 2023. Now we are going to be obliged to establish the deposit and return system in 2026, so before the PPWR. And that's an obligation that comes from this law that I mentioned, the Spanish law on waste and contaminated soils for circular economy.
Yeah, I see. Joanne, I want to go back to a point you were making earlier in terms of giving economic actors and countries the right tools in order to achieve this 15% reduction target, if that is the right reduction target. Can you expand a little bit on what you think is missing and what should come of the implementation acts that we can expect from the Commission?
Well, what I think is missing is really more ambition when it comes to reuse and prevention. There's some symbolic targets there, which don't make economic sense. I mean, if you want to really invest in a transformation, you need to really have a target that actually makes economic sense, and they should definitely be higher. And I think on the secondary raw materials markets, I think that's a very important thing as well. I think the PPWR focuses too much on recycling, and that is a fact. And depending who you ask, you will get different answers as to like what is the solution to make this happen. I mean, the industry will say the problem is waste management. I mean, then you go to the waste management, and it happens that, well, they will say, well, the information from the industry is not there. So, like, we got this study in Spain, right, that we were seeing that the PRO was reporting data, and the PRO, let's not forget, is the industry coming together and reporting data about a separate collection. It happened, it was not like an error of like 2 or 3 or 5%. It was an error of like more than 30 points. So, and it's not for Spain, there's other countries as well. There's huge disparities between what is information from the industry and what is the reality on the ground. And we know what is happening on the ground because we work with municipalities, we see what is being collected, we see actually how what is they're getting paid for dealing with the waste is not corresponding to the real cost. So I think that's the issue of who enforces legislation. I mean, so far it looks like member states are responsible, but they don't have the means to do that. And it looks, I mean, it's a joke, but if NGOs really wanted to start monitoring the implementation of EU law, that's not going to work. So I think that something we're going to need is like independent monitoring body at EU level, or I don't know at which level, that actually is capable of making sure that the information that the PROs provide is realistic. So I think that is key. On the secondary raw materials market, something very important is that we are assuming that actually that recycling works. And recycling is necessary. We need more recycling. But the issue of plastic, for example, you would think that with the PPWR, with the signature of the PPWR, the market for recycled plastic should go up. You have a legal security there. And what happens is actually that plastic recyclers are struggling in Europe. We have a recycled content target that actually can be met with imported recycled content from abroad, which therefore means that we're not going to have a secondary raw material market for plastic, provided as long as you can have imported recycled content from abroad. So actually, how do we deal with these big blind spots or like loopholes in the legislation that actually undercut the measures in the circularity? We're not going to have plastic circularity in Europe for as long as we have a global recycling market and EU recycled content targets. How do we address this? It's not in the PPWR. It's going to be it will have to be addressed. Chemical recycling is something that occupied lots of space in the media, etc. What we're seeing is that after the PPWR is approved, you would think that there's a market security there, but actually there's bankruptcies of chemical recycling plants. So we need recycling. Recycling in the current conditions with this PPWR, at least for plastic, is going to be extremely, extremely complicated because virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled content, and it's cheaper for sure than anything that comes from a pyrolysis plant. So how do we address all of this? I think it's key. So it's good to have DRS. It's great because that's going to give us like the rates that you need in terms of collection, the quality that you need. It will allow you to actually close the loops. But yeah, what do we do with the recyclate once it's there? I think something is not addressed yet.
Francesca, I can see that you have a lot to say there. You'd like to comment on Joanne's statements, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, let me perhaps first just make a statement. I frankly believe that we're no longer in the 1980s. I've been sitting here listening to the previous discussion as well. And it's a constant, this picture of these old industries. There are the good industries that want to innovate, and there are the bad guys that don't want to innovate. So that's a very, very old narrative. Again, maybe true in the 1980s. We're over that. It's 40 years, nearly 50 later. So let's, if you want to really achieve change, right? Because if we want to talk about what we're achieving on net zero, I know it's not the energy session, but please let you reflect on some numbers. Look at Germany. Last Monday, the CO2 emissions in Germany, because it chose to close down nuclear power plant, they emitted 638 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour because there was no wind blowing. Is this helping the climate change cause? So, I think we need to start actually talking about reality. We need to start stopping saying that it's industry's fault, even when waste management doesn't work. Now it's industry's fault, really? Well, I guess we'll have the real answer in 2030, when there will be no longer any non-recyclable packaging on the market, because by law, everything will have to be recyclable. So by 2030, I want to see everything recycled at scale. And if that doesn't happen, I'm sorry, but we can't just blame industry for that not happening. We have to blame member states' resistance. We have to make also recyclers' resistance to innovate. You know, what you just said on chemical recycling, if we are so against chemical recycling, let's go back to the PPWR and let's drop the target that mandate recycled content for contact-sensitive applications. You cannot put mechanical recycled plastic back in contact with food and drinks. So let's have that discussion. Given that now the targets are there, you need chemical recycling, otherwise you can't deliver those targets. So whose fault is that?
I'm not blaming anybody. What I'm saying is, how are you going to compete on price with the biggest expansion of petrochemical in the world that actually makes recycled content just not profitable? So like, tell me, I mean, I'm not blaming us. It's like, I want recycling to work. Why are you going to pay this extra for
totally
recycled
agree
content?
with that. Totally agree with that. And that's a pity we only have 9 minutes. You know, the problem is not what we're discussing now, circular economy, how we fix these problems. No worries, we will no longer have this material produced in Europe being primary or recycled material. So I got a number from Plastics Europe just released the other week. Sorry, I'm getting old, so I need to put the paper a bit farther away from me. But basically, both, you know, primary, like virgin and recycled, went down last year, more or less, both of them by 8%, 8.3 and 7.8, respectively. Global plastic production went up by 3.6. We saw what happened in Busan the other day. Why we're losing the basic material industry is not because of circular economy, it's not because of the Green Deal, it's because for the last 20 years, we've been killing these industries in Europe with wrong electricity market reform. We've done nothing to address the energy crisis. We continue to do nothing about it, together with many other structural issues. And I'm sorry, but here and now that we have a problem, and the last I heard from recyclers the other day was that the reason is collection is too costly in Europe. That's why it's cheaper to import Chinese plastics. Guys, we've been trying to recycle this for what, the last 30 years? Well, where are the people supposed to do collection the last 30 years? Belgium, and very happy to live in Belgium where I can put, finally, flexible packaging, plastic packaging in the blue bag so it gets recycled, but it's only happened, 3 years ago. And in many countries, that doesn't happen. So I'm really a little bit tired of hearing this story that we cannot do it. Yeah, perhaps now is a little bit late, but then let's stop talking about circular economy. So if you still want to try and do this without being dependent for everything that we do and just being basically an importer region, I'm also quite scared of hearing about the made in Europe being the solution. All I hear, every event I go lately, is about new barriers, trade barriers. That will keep the European industry alive for a few more years until we die of a slow death. I think Mr. Draghi talked about slow agony or radical change. We have the option of radical change, but we need to be brave. And we need to demand that all the actors involved do their part. It cannot just be industry.
But you cannot ignore the fact that in order to achieve these targets, we are going to need to produce less packaging pollution, and that means using less packaging. And that means industries making the effort to use less packaging, and given their reticence towards any kind of reusable targets, any kind of mandatory reusable targets, how can we sort of square that hole?
Let me correct you on that. As far as Europe is concerned, there has been no resistance against reuse targets. We wanted to have an informed discussion of reuse targets, and that informed discussion required also discussing infrastructure, costs. My point, and I repeated that to the Commission and any stakeholder I met, is how do we move from niche reuse solution, which all of my members do, they're all involved in some kind of pilot project on reuse, niche, to large distribution. What does it take? You talk about consumer awareness. What does it take to do that too? What do we need to put in place? How much is going to cost? That discussion in a year and a half, unfortunately, didn't happen. And the biggest problem with the Green Deal, probably the biggest failure of the Green Deal, has been the kind of political speed that was imposed onto it. We're talking about packaging, the same as happened in all the other legislative acts. I've been in Brussels for a long time, and I have no recollection last legislative term and previous one, of any file, certainly any of the Green Deal file, approved with a second reading. Everything is done in the second reading. Now we have 40+ implementing act, hugely complex. We have about 1 year to produce the design for recycling guidelines. Is that a joke? Why is that the case? And are you going to blame industry then if the process is delayed?
Alejandro, perhaps you'd like to give your opinion on this.
Yes, I think that we can not blame, but industry is responsible of the growth in packaging that we have suffered in terms of continent of the European Union, or in terms of country. In the case of Spain, during the last 10 years, we have increased the plastic packaging for almost 30%. So that's something that industry has done, and it's true that you have to collaborate with all actors, and you have to have local authorities working in the collection. You have to have governments doing regulations, the European Union doing regulations, but you cannot complain about the lack of capacity of local authorities recollecting and recycling, and then increase the problem by 30% with more packaging every year. And packaging regulation is something that has been there for years. I mean, it's not a surprise for the industry, but during the last regulation, industry has failed to reduce packaging. It has done the opposite. It has increased packaging. So it's kind of unfair to blame local authorities or national authorities for that. It's true that we have to invest in capacity building, but it's true that industry has to do things differently, because they have failed to reduce, they have failed to prevent packaging. Indeed, they have made the opposite, increasing the packaging every year.
And blaming the waste companies, blaming the local authorities. So we all are victims here, but actually that the industry claims to be the victim of this process. Well, as we were saying, that the industry...
I'm not claiming that.
Well, what I'm saying here is, your point is really not clear. How are you planning to put all this packaging in the market, which has no market value when it becomes waste, because you're competing against virgin plastic, which is a lot more cheap. It's a lot cheaper. Why? Yes, we don't want protectionism, but how are we going to compete in price and use the waste that the local authorities are supposed to collect, when actually the brands are preferring to buy, obviously, cheaper products from China that we don't know if they are recycled content in it. It's with self-verification system, etc. But the brands, the European brands, want to buy recyclate from China instead of recyclate from Europe. And I'm not blaming the brands.
That's a fact. You spoke to the brands. That's a commercial strategy.
Not everyone at once, please. Alejandro.
No, it's true that we have to invest in custom surveillance, in market surveillance, in
Thank you.
assuring. No, it's true, assuring that we have a level playing field for European companies, and that competition is fair. Otherwise, we're gonna delocalize businesses abroad. We're gonna delocalize jobs. We're gonna export environmental impacts abroad. And instead of being exporting regulation as we could be if this custom or market surveillance would work, we're gonna relocate the problem abroad. So it's true that we have to protect businesses and competitiveness here, but it's true that the problem that we have is a problem of lack of prevention. I mean, of even every year growing amounts of packaging and packaging waste that come to the waste treatment facilities, and a lack of capacity coming from these waste plants in order to cope with this amount of packaging in this case, or other kind of waste flows.
Mm. Can I just say a word on transparency and enforcement? Because you mentioned before the lack of transparency with PRO. So we've been advocating very strongly for actual taking care of transparency of PRO in the Waste Framework Directive. Unfortunately, this part is not being revised by the Commission choice. So let's see again, Circular Economy Act. Maybe we're luckier than that, because at the moment, the money, and this huge amount of money which is collected in EPR fees, the PRO have no clue how the money is spent by the local authorities. There is no way to trace if that money is actually used for collection, sorting and recycling, or simply take their beautiful material, Bernie, I do energy recovery, which is a great source of income for local authorities. So we love to have more transparency. And I also like to recall that actually the very first reason to reviewing the directive, as stated in the directive in 2018, was to strengthen enforcement, which we as an organization have always called for stronger enforcement of the PPWR rules. And thirdly, on minimization, we strongly support the minimization targets, the reduction targets. Just make sure that this doesn't sound like industry is resisting actually reducing the amount of packaging put on the market. Now, putting that entirely on industry, while there is also a demand from society, different way of living, then we need to address that too. So it's a little bit too simplistic to say the industry just want to, for the companies, for the brands, packaging is a huge cost. So I can tell you that they're doing also a lot of effort to try and reduce that cost.
I'm afraid there's a big red clock staring at us now, telling us we've run out of time. As you can see, everyone, it's quite difficult on this topic to translate from talk to action when the blame game has evidently not ended. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today and sharing some of their thoughts on the next steps for the PPWR. Please remain in your seats. Our sustainability editor will come on shortly to have some closing remarks. So thank you so much.